He didn't walk into that saloon looking for trouble. He walked in carrying a dying child, a broken plea, and the last of whatever pride a man could hold on to after 3 days without sleep. The room went quiet the second he stepped through those doors. And then they laughed. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The summer of 1874 didn't forgive anybody. It didn't forgive the land, which cracked and split under a sun that had forgotten what mercy felt like. It didn't forgive the cattle, which dropped in the open range by the dozens that July. And it sure didn't forgive the people of Harlan's Creek, Colorado, a town carved out of rock and stubbornness, populated by men and women who'd survived enough hard years that softness had gone right out of them like water through sand. Nobody in Harlan's Creek expected anything unusual that Tuesday morning. They were wrong. Caleb Hunter had been riding for 3 days straight. He didn't stop to eat. He stopped twice to water his horse, once to pray, though he hadn't prayed in 11 years and wasn't sure the words still worked, and not once to sleep. The boy in his arms had a fever bad enough to cook a man from the inside. Every few miles, Caleb pressed the back of his wrist to the child's forehead and felt the heat radiating up like an open furnace door. And every time he did, he rode faster. He didn't know the boy's name yet. The boy hadn't said a word since Caleb found him. 3 days earlier, Caleb had been exactly where he always was, alone in the high ranges above the timberline, repairing a fence line along the western edge of his property. He'd heard something. Not a sound you'd catalog right away, not a cry or a voice, more like the absence of sound where sound should have been, the kind of quiet that sits wrong. He followed it. What he found stopped him cold. A burned-out wagon, still smoking, settled into a shallow ravine like something the earth had swallowed halfway. 2 horses down, a man and a woman laid out in the dirt. He could see from 30 yards away that there was nothing to be done for them. Bandits. The kind that worked the mountain passes in summer, when the trade routes opened up and travelers came through who didn't know any better. Caleb dismounted. He stood there for a moment, with his hat in his hands, jaw tight, eyes moving over what was left of someone's life. A tin pot, a Bible, 3 lengths of rope, a child's shoe. 1 child's shoe. He heard it then, a sound so small it almost wasn't there, coming from underneath the wagon. He got down on his knees in the dirt and looked. 2 faces stared back at him. A boy, maybe 8 years old, pressing himself against a girl, maybe 2 years younger, both of them tucked so far back under the wreckage they'd have been invisible to anyone not looking hard. The boy's shirt was dark and wet on one side. The girl's eyes were wide and fixed on Caleb, like she was deciding right then and there whether she was going to survive this or not. Caleb held still. "It's all right," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He hadn't used it much in recent months. "I ain't gonna hurt you." Neither child moved. "I know that don't mean much coming from a stranger," he said. "But your mama and your daddy, they'd want you out from under there. And I'm the only one here, so you're gonna have to trust me a little. Just a little." The girl moved first. She crawled out slowly, her dress torn at the knee, her face pale and streaked. She stood up and looked at him, and he saw that she wasn't crying. She had already moved past crying into something quieter and harder. The boy came out after her, and that was when Caleb saw the wound. A gash along his ribs, packed with dirt, already swelling angry and red. Caleb didn't say anything else. He just lifted the boy, careful as he could manage, and said to the girl, "Can you ride behind me? Hold on to my back?" She nodded once. She didn't let go the entire 3 days. He did what he could for the boy up in the cabin. He'd handled wounds before. His own, mostly. Out here where the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride. And calling for help wasn't always an option. He cleaned it, packed it, wrapped it tight. But infection had already set in. He could feel it in the way the boy's body went rigid when he slept, the way his breathing turned shallow by the second night, the way the fever climbed and didn't come back down. By the morning of the third day, Caleb made the decision he'd been arguing himself out of for 48 hours. He had to ride into town. He didn't want to. Towns and Caleb Hunter had never gotten along particularly well. He was too tall, too quiet, too rough around the edges in a way that made people nervous. He didn't drink much, didn't talk much, didn't smile in the way that put folks at ease. He'd come up to Harlan's Creek maybe 4 times in the past 2 years, for supplies, for nothing else. And each time he'd felt the stares follow him down the street, like he was something the town hadn't decided what to do with yet. But the boy's breathing had gone wrong in the night, and Caleb Hunter, for all his faults, was not a man who let a child die because he was too proud to ask for help. He told the girl, her name was Lily, she'd whispered it to him that second morning, the first word she'd spoken, to stay put. He showed her where the food was, where the water was, and he told her he'd be back before dark. Then he rode. The saloon in Harlan's Creek was called the Dusty Boot, which said everything you needed to know about its ambitions. It served as the unofficial center of town business, the place where decisions got made, where disputes got settled, where information traveled fastest. Caleb pushed through the doors at 10:30 in the morning, with the boy against his chest, one arm under the child's back, the other holding the doorframe for half a second as his eyes adjusted to the dim. The room smelled like beer and sawdust, and the particular kind of boredom that came from a slow Tuesday in a small town. 14, maybe 15 men, a bartender, 2 women near the back playing cards. Every one of them looked up. Caleb walked to the center of the room. "I need a wife," he said, "by sundown." The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then the laughter started. It wasn't mean at first. It was confused. The laughter of people who think they've misheard something. But it built fast, the way laughter always did when it had company. And within 10 seconds, the whole room was in it. A man near the window slapped his knee. The bartender shook his head with a grin like he'd heard the best joke of the summer. Someone at the back table said something Caleb couldn't quite make out, but it got a loud response. Caleb stood there. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just waited. And slowly, one by one, the laughter began to run out of fuel. Because the boy in his arms still hadn't moved. Because the blood on Caleb's shirt was real. Because the look on Caleb's face was not the look of a man who was joking. It was the look of a man who had run out of options and had made peace with that fact somewhere on the road between the mountains and this room. The bartender set down his glass. "You serious, Hunter?" "I'm serious." A man near the door, stocky, red-faced, wearing a lawman's badge that he carried like it was the most important thing he'd ever been given, stepped forward. His name was Sheriff Dale Pruitt, and he had the particular confidence of a man who'd never been wrong in his own estimation. "What's wrong with the boy?" Pruitt asked. "Fever, wound on his ribs, infection. He needs a doctor." "Doc Milner's on Front Street," Pruitt said. "Same as always." "I know where he is," Caleb said. "I already spoke to him." Something shifted in the room. "And?" the bartender said. Caleb's jaw tightened. "And he said he won't treat a child without a legal guardian present to authorize it. Single man living in the mountains ain't a guardian in the eyes of the law. He told me." Caleb paused, and something moved through his expression that he didn't let go all the way to his face. "He told me to come back with a family." Pruitt folded his arms. "Well, that's the law." "That's what I said," Caleb replied, flat as a board. "That's why I'm here." Another man laughed, shorter this time, still disbelieving. "You rode into town, walked into a saloon, and asked a room full of strangers for a wife? Just like that. Just, you need one, so you walked in and asked?" "I tried to think of another way," Caleb said. "I rode 3 days on no sleep. I couldn't come up with one." The red-faced man shook his head. "That ain't how marriage works, Hunter." "I know how marriage works." "Do you? Because marriage is the boy is 8 years old." Caleb's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. Something in the flatness of it cut through the noise better than volume could have. "His parents are dead in a ravine 2 days north. He's been burning up for 36 hours. I've done everything I know how to do, and it ain't been enough." He looked around the room slowly, making sure he met eyes where eyes would meet his. "I'm not asking anybody to love me. I'm not asking anybody to leave their life. I'm asking somebody, anybody, to walk with me to the courthouse and sign their name next to mine so that a child doesn't die because of a paperwork problem." The room was quiet, a different kind of quiet than before. Pruitt opened his mouth. A chair scraped back. Everyone turned. She was standing at a table in the far corner, a table Caleb hadn't noticed because it was half hidden behind a support beam, the kind of spot you'd choose if you didn't want to be part of what was happening in the rest of the room. She'd been sitting there the whole time. She had a cup of coffee in front of her and a stack of papers she'd been working through. The kind of organized quiet that said she'd claimed that corner on purpose. Clara Hayes. Caleb didn't know her name yet. What he saw was a woman in her mid-30s, brown hair pulled back, summer dress that had been washed too many times. She was thin in the way that came from not wasting anything. Not food, not time, not words. Her eyes were dark and still and taking in every detail of the room with the kind of attention that made you feel seen, whether you wanted to be or not. She didn't stand up all the way at first. She just pushed her chair back and sat forward, and she looked at the boy in Caleb's arms for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. "How old is the girl?" she asked. Caleb blinked. Of everything he'd expected someone to say, that was not it. 6, he said. "Maybe 7. "Where is she now?" "My cabin, North Range, up past the—" "Is she safe?" "Yes, ma'am. I left her food and water, and I showed her the latch on the door." Clara nodded slowly. She looked at the boy again. "What's his name?" "He hasn't told me yet." Something crossed her face. Not pity. Something more complicated than pity. She stood up. All the way up this time. She was taller than he'd expected. Pruitt said, "Miss Hayes." "Hush, Dale," she said, without looking at him. She walked toward Caleb. The room parted for her the way rooms parted for people who moved with certainty. She stopped 3 feet in front of him and looked at the boy. Up close, Caleb could see her taking in the details. The color of the child's skin, the rapid, shallow rise and fall of his chest, the way his small hands hung loose and wrong at his sides. "Have you slept?" she asked. Caleb looked at her. "Not recently." "Have you eaten?" "Ma'am, that's a no," she said. She looked up at him, and her eyes were direct in a way that didn't feel like a challenge, just like the truth. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "All right. If I do this—" She paused. Around them, the room was so still, Caleb could hear the flies. "If I sign my name, and we get the boy treated, and he lives, what happens after? Do you ride back to your mountain and disappear? Do I become a name on a paper you forget about? Or do you—" "No," Caleb said. "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "Do you intend to raise these children?" she asked. "Both of them. Not until the next season, or until it gets hard." "Raise them." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. His arms tightened around the boy without meaning to. "I found them," he said quietly. "I didn't find them to leave them." "That's not quite the same as answering my question." "No," he said. "It ain't." He shifted the boy slightly, and he looked down at the child's face. The slack jaw, the faint tremble in the eyelids. When he looked back up, his voice was lower. "I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know how to live in a town or follow the rules of one. What I know is that I don't leave what I choose to protect. And 3 days ago, I chose." Clara was quiet. Pruitt said from across the room, "Miss Hayes, you can't honestly be considering—" "I'm a school teacher, Dale." She turned her head just slightly toward him. "I've been considering things you've told me not to since I was 12. Keep up." She turned back to Caleb. "One more question." He waited. "Will you be kind?" she asked. The room was absolutely still. Caleb Hunter had been asked a lot of things in his life. He'd been asked to work harder, ride longer, stay away, come back, take less, give more. Nobody had ever asked him that. Not like that. Not looking at him the way she was looking at him, like the answer actually mattered, like it was the only answer that did. "I'll try," he said. "Every day, I'll try." She nodded once. "Then I'll marry you," said Clara Hayes. The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was more like a collective exhale, the sound of people recalibrating what they thought they knew about how the day was going to go. Pruitt said, "Now hold on, we need a judge or a justice of the peace," Clara said, turning away from Caleb and picking up her papers from the table. She moved with the calm efficiency of a woman who had made her decision and was now simply executing it. "Earl Beaumont is the JP. He lives on Sycamore Street. He owes me for 3 months of tutoring his youngest, and he knows it." She tucked the papers under her arm. "The child needs the doctor first. We go to Doc Milner, we tell him the paperwork will follow within the hour, and if he gives us trouble—" She looked at Pruitt. "You'll handle that, Dale. That much I know you can do." Pruitt stared at her. "Dale." "Yes, ma'am." Clara looked at Caleb. "Can you carry him another 2 blocks?" "Yes." "Then let's go." She walked toward the door. Caleb followed. And behind them, in the saloon called the Dusty Boot, on a Tuesday in the dead summer heat of 1874, 14 men sat in complete silence, trying to figure out how a morning that had started as a joke had turned into the most serious thing any of them had witnessed in years. Doc Milner was a small man with wire spectacles and the habit of exhaling through his nose when he was irritated, which was often. When Caleb walked through his door with the boy and Clara Hayes behind him, the exhale was long and sustained. "Miss Hayes," he said. "He needs treatment," she said. "The paperwork will be completed within the hour. If you need to confirm the legality of what I'm telling you, Sheriff Pruitt is outside." Milner looked at the boy. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. He sighed, a different kind this time. "Bring him back," he said. Caleb laid the boy on the examination table and stepped back, and for the first time in 3 days, someone else was carrying the weight. He stood against the wall with his hat in his hands and watched the doctor work, and his chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the riving. Clara stood beside him. After a moment, she said quietly, "You should sit down." "I'm fine." "You've been holding that child for 3 days," she said. "Your arms are shaking." Caleb looked at his hands. They were, in fact, shaking slightly. The sustained tremor of muscle that had been locked in one position too long. He sat. Clara sat beside him. Not close. 2 feet of space between them. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the doctor work with the same focused calm she seemed to bring to everything. "You don't seem scared," Caleb said. "I am," she replied. She didn't look at him. "I've just had a lot of practice, not showing it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you stand up?" She turned her head and looked at him, and for the first time he saw something underneath the composure, something tired and old and very carefully maintained. "Because no one else was going to," she said. "And I've spent a long time watching things go wrong because no one wanted to be the first one to move." She turned back to the doctor. "I'm tired of that." The doctor called for them to wait outside while he worked. They sat on the bench in front of his office, side by side, in the full August heat, not speaking. People walked past on the street and stared openly. A woman across the road leaned to her companion and said something behind her hand, eyes fixed on Clara. Clara didn't react. Caleb noticed. "You'll get talk," he said. "I already get talk," she replied. "This will just be more specific." She glanced at him sideways. "Does that concern you?" Caleb thought about it. "No," he said. "Does it concern you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not as much as that boy's breathing." He almost smiled. Almost. They went to Earl Beaumont at noon. The justice of the peace was a heavy-set man in his 60s who heard the situation, looked at Clara over his spectacles for a very long time, asked Caleb 3 questions that Caleb answered without flinching, and then pulled out his registry. "You understand this is legal and binding," Beaumont said. "Yes, sir," Clara said. "And you, Hunter?" "Yes, sir. No takesies backsies, as my grandchildren say." Neither of them responded. Beaumont shrugged. "All right then." They signed. Caleb Hunter and Clara Hayes were married at 12:17 in the afternoon on August the 9th, 1874. The only witnesses were Earl Beaumont's housekeeper and a confused tabby cat that wandered in from the back garden. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just 2 names on a page, and somewhere across town, a small boy who didn't yet know that 2 strangers had just built the walls of a life around him. When they returned to Doc Milner's office, the doctor met them at the door. He looked at them both. He looked at the floor. "The fever's broken," he said. "He's going to need a week of bed rest, and he's going to be weak for a while after that. But the infection hasn't gone systemic. He'll live." Caleb stood very still. His jaw worked once. He pressed his lips together and nodded, and he looked up at the sky above the rooftops of Harlan's Creek, that wide, merciless blue August sky, and he breathed. Clara said, "Can we see him?" "He's awake," the doctor said. "Just barely." They went in together. The boy was small against the white of the examination table, eyes open to slits, looking at the ceiling. When Caleb's shadow fell across him, those eyes moved. Caleb crouched down to eye level. "Hey," he said, quiet. The boy's lips moved, barely a sound. Caleb leaned in. "Say again?" The boy swallowed with effort. "Thomas," he said. "My name's Thomas." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Good name," he said. "Thomas." He said it again, like he was setting it down somewhere safe. "I'm Caleb. That's Clara." He didn't reach for the boy's hand. He just stayed at his level, close enough to hear him breathing. "You're going to be all right, Thomas." The boy's eyes stayed on him. "My sister," Thomas said. His voice was thin as paper. "Lily." "She's safe," Caleb said. "I promise you. I'm going back for her today." The boy's eyes filled, and then, very slowly, his jaw stopped being tight. Something in his face let go, some held thing, some weeks-long or months-long bracing against the worst. And he turned his head away from them and cried the way a child cried when they finally felt safe enough to. Caleb stood. He put his hat on. He looked at Clara across the room, and there was something between them in that moment that neither of them had words for yet. Something that had been built in the space of 3 hours out of equal parts necessity and courage, and the specific kind of respect that only came from watching someone do a hard thing when they didn't have to. "I need to go back for the girl," he said. Clara nodded. "I know." She looked at Thomas, then back at him. "I'll stay here. Go." He looked at her for one more moment. "I'll be back before dark." "I know," she said again. He walked out. The summer heat hit him full in the face the second he cleared the doorway, and he stood there for just a moment on the board sidewalk of Harlan's Creek. A married man, a father of 2 children he hadn't known 4 days ago. A man with more life than he'd had when he woke up that morning. And he put his foot in the stirrup, and he rode. Caleb rode hard. The mountain trail was familiar enough that his horse knew the way without being told, which was good because Caleb's mind was somewhere else entirely. It kept circling back to the same things, Thomas's face when the fear finally let go. Clara's voice saying, "I know," twice, like she'd already decided she was going to be steady before any of this started. The way the room in that saloon had gone from laughter to silence and back to something he still didn't have a name for. He'd asked a room full of strangers for a wife, and one of them had said yes. He still wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. He reached the cabin just before 3 in the afternoon. He didn't even get fully dismounted before the door opened and Lily appeared in the frame, one hand gripping the wood, the other balled at her side. She looked at him, then past him. "Where's Thomas?" she said. "He's in town," Caleb said, dropping down from the saddle. "He's all right. A doctor's looking after him." Lily stared at him with those wide, unreadable eyes. She had her mother's dress on still, torn at the hem, too big in the shoulders, and she'd braided her own hair sometime in the hours he'd been gone. Badly, but she'd done it herself, and that said something. "He's really all right?" she said. "He's really all right. He told me his name this morning." Something moved through Lily's face, relief so big it nearly broke the surface. She pressed her lips together hard and nodded once. And Caleb recognized the gesture because Thomas had done the same thing when he'd heard about Lily. These 2 children had been holding each other up so long that showing feeling had started to feel like a luxury they couldn't afford. "Get your things," he said gently. "Whatever you want to bring." She turned and went back inside. She came out 3 minutes later with a cloth bundle he hadn't seen before. She'd found it somewhere in the cabin, or brought it from the wagon, he wasn't sure. She held it against her chest and looked at him. "Are we going to live with you?" she asked. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "if that's all right with you." Lily thought about it with the seriousness of someone much older. "Do you have enough food?" she asked. "I'll get more." "Do you know how to make cornbread?" "No," he admitted. "Mama did," she said. "I watched her enough times. I think I remember most of it." She adjusted the bundle in her arms. "I could make it, if you got the cornmeal." Caleb looked at this 6-year-old child, offering to contribute to a household she'd known about for less than 4 days, in the middle of the worst weeks of her life, and something in his chest did the thing he was not prepared for. "That'd be real fine," he said, keeping his voice level. "Let's go." He got her back to town by late afternoon, and when he walked into Doc Milner's office, with Lily's hand in his, the first thing that happened was Thomas lifted his head off the pillow and said, "Lily." And Lily, who had not cried once in the 4 days Caleb had known her, sat down on the edge of that examination table and put her arms around her brother, and pressed her face against his shoulder, and cried so hard Her whole body shook. Thomas put his arms around her. Caleb stood in the doorway and didn't go in. Clara appeared beside him. He hadn't even heard her move. She looked at the two children and said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "She held it together the whole time, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. "The whole time," Caleb said. Clara exhaled slowly. "Children do that. They hold everything together until the moment they don't have to anymore." She paused. Then it all comes out at once. Caleb watched Lily's shoulders shake.
"Is that bad?" "No," Clara said. "That's actually the healthy part."
Doc Milner said Thomas needed at least 5 days of rest before he could be moved. 5 days meant they needed somewhere to stay in town. This was the part of the problem Caleb hadn't fully thought through on the ride down from the mountains. And it landed on him now, with the full weight of its complications. He didn't own anything in Harlan's Creek. He didn't rent anything. He had the cabin 2 days north, and the clothes on his back, and about $40 in his coat pocket, which he'd brought in case the doctor needed paying. Clara, it turned out, rented 2 rooms above the general store on Front Street. She'd lived there for 2 years, since taking the teaching position at the school. The rooms were small, tidy, and entirely organized in the way that said the woman living in them thought carefully about how she used space. Caleb stood in the doorway of the larger room while Clara moved efficiently around it, deciding what could be rearranged, what could be moved. He noticed a shelf of books along one wall, more books than he'd owned in his entire life. He noticed a small table by the window with papers on it and a lamp positioned for reading at night. "I can sleep in the barn," he said. Clara stopped moving. She turned and looked at him with an expression that said she was deciding whether to be offended or amused. She landed somewhere in between. "This is August," she said. "You are not sleeping in a barn." "I've slept in worse." "I don't doubt it. But you're not doing it because you're too polite to take up space in your own—" She stopped. She looked around the room. He could see her calibrating something. "In rooms where you have every right to be." She set down what she was holding. "The children will need a real bed. That's not negotiable. I'll take the smaller room. You can have the cot from the storeroom downstairs. Mr. Finch won't mind. I've done him enough favors." "Miss Hayes—" "Clara," she said. He stopped. "You signed your name next to mine this morning," she said. "You can use my given name." She said it like it was a practical matter, not a sentimental one. "Clara," he said. It felt strange in his mouth. Not wrong, just new. "I don't want to put you out." "You're not putting me out," she said. "You're complicating my life considerably, but that's a different thing." She looked at him directly. "I went into this with my eyes open, Mr. Hunter. I'm not going to pretend I did otherwise and start acting put upon 2 hours later. That's not who I am." Caleb looked at her. "Caleb," he said. She blinked. "If I'm using your given name," he said, "you should use mine." A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Almost imperceptible, but there. "All right," she said. "Caleb." He nodded. She nodded. And they went about the business of making 4 people fit into 2 small rooms above a general store in a town that was already talking about them. The talking, it turned out, was considerable. By the next morning, everyone in Harlan's Creek knew what had happened. In a town that size, news moved faster than weather, and news this good. A mountain hermit walks in off the range, asks for a wife at gunpoint, and a school teacher says yes, was the kind of story that got told and retold until it started changing shape. Mrs. Aldridge, who ran the post office, told 3 people that Clara had clearly lost her mind. Mr. Beaumont's housekeeper told two more that the whole thing was romantic, actually, if you thought about it right. Sheriff Pruitt told anyone who would listen that he was going to be keeping an eye on the situation, without specifying what exactly he expected to see. Caleb heard pieces of it when he went out to get food that morning. He didn't react. He bought what he needed, said as few words as possible, and walked back. Clara heard more of it, because people felt freer talking to her, or around her, than they did around Caleb. A woman stopped her on the street outside the doctor's office and said, very gently, that she hoped Clara knew what she'd gotten herself into. Clara thanked her for her concern, smiled politely, and kept walking. What she didn't do was tell Caleb any of it. He found out anyway. He came back from getting supplies the second afternoon to find Clara on the bench outside the doctor's office, with a piece of paper in her hand and an expression on her face like she was solving a math problem, and the numbers kept coming out wrong. He sat down beside her. "What's that?" he asked. "Nothing." She folded it. "Clara." She looked at him sideways. She unfolded the paper and handed it to him without a word. It was a note, unsigned. 7 words. A real woman would know better than this. Caleb read it twice. His jaw tightened. He looked up and down the street with the calm, specific attention of someone cataloging information rather than reacting to it. "You know who wrote it?" he asked. "I have a suspicion," she said. "It doesn't matter." "It matters." "Caleb." She took the note back from him, folded it again, and put it in her pocket. "I've been a single woman in this town for 2 years. I've gotten looks and comments and unsolicited opinions about my choices since the day I arrived. This is not new." She looked at him. "What would you do if you knew who wrote it?" He thought about it. "Talk to them." "And say what?" "That they owe you an apology." Clara studied him for a moment. "That's very decent of you," she said. "But I've learned that demanding apologies from people who don't believe they owe you one mostly just makes them dig in deeper." She looked away. "The best response to that kind of thing is to keep going. To be seen still standing 3 months from now, 6 months from now. That's what changes minds, not confrontations." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've had to," she said simply. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he hadn't let himself do much in the past 2 days, because there'd always been something else requiring attention. She was tired. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in the way that people got tired when they'd been holding something together for a long time without acknowledgement. And she wouldn't say so. That was clear. She would not say so, and she would fold the note into her pocket and keep walking, because that was what she'd learned to do. "I'm sorry," he said. She turned. "For what?" "For the complications," he said. "You said I was complicating your life. You were being generous. I've dropped a marriage, 2 children, and a town full of opinions on you in 48 hours. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You didn't force my hand." "No, but I put a dying child in front of you and called it a choice." She looked at him for a long moment. "That child is why I stood up," she said. "Not you." She said it without cruelty, just precision. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't stand up because of how you looked, or what you said, or some feeling I had in the moment. I stood up because a little boy was dying, and the men in that room were going to let it happen, while they laughed." Her voice was steady and quiet and very serious. "That's the thing I couldn't walk past." Caleb held her gaze. "I know," he said. "That's part of why I trusted you." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "When you asked me that question, will you be kind?" I knew you weren't asking because you wanted reassurance. He looked down at his hands. You were asking because you'd already decided kindness was the thing worth protecting. Same as me. He paused. That's a rare thing to find in a person. Clara didn't say anything. She looked away, down the street, at the people moving through the bright August afternoon, and she pressed her lips together in that way she had of receiving something without showing the full weight of it. Thomas asked about you this morning, she said after a moment. Caleb looked up. What'd he say? He asked if you were coming back. She glanced at him. I told him you were getting food. He said... She paused, and something almost soft came into her face. He said, good, because I want to tell him thank you, and I haven't done that yet. Caleb looked at the ground. He's 8 years old, Clara said quietly. He's buried his parents, he nearly died. He's in a strange town with strangers, and his first thought when he woke up was that he owed someone a thank you. She shook her head slightly. His parents raised him well. Yeah, Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Thomas said thank you that afternoon. He said it seriously, sitting up in the bed with his hands folded in his lap, looking Caleb directly in the eye the way someone had taught him was the right way to mean something. Thank you for coming back for us, he said, and for riding all night, and for... He paused, and his young face worked through something. For not leaving us there. Caleb sat in the chair beside the bed. He leaned forward, arms on his knees. You don't need to thank me for that, he said. Mama said you always thank people who do right by you, Thomas said, even if they say you don't need to. Caleb nodded slowly. Your mama was right. Thomas looked at him. Are you going to be our father now? The room went very still. Caleb didn't look away. He held the boy's gaze and took his time, because this was not a question that deserved a quick answer. I'd like to be, he said, if that's something you want. But I won't push you on it. You get to decide. Thomas processed this. Does Clara know? Know what? That you'd like to be. Caleb paused. We haven't talked about it yet. Thomas nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that adults had logistics to work through. You should probably talk to her, he said. Lily says Clara is the kind of person you should be honest with. Lily talked to her this morning while you were getting supplies. Caleb straightened slightly. Lily talked to Clara? For a long time, Thomas said. I don't know what about, but Lily was better after. He looked at his hands. Lily doesn't talk to people much anymore. Not since... He stopped. I know, Caleb said, quiet. She talked to Clara, though. Thomas looked up at him. I think Clara's safe, like the kind of person who doesn't use things against you. 8 years old, Caleb thought again. 8 years old, and reading people like that. Yeah, he said. I think you're right about that. He found Clara that evening in the narrow hallway outside the children's room, the door cracked open, listening. He came up beside her, and she gestured with a small movement of her hand for him to be quiet. He stood there and listened. Inside, Lily was talking. Her voice was quiet, steady, unspooling, telling Thomas something about their parents, something about a farm they'd had before, a dog named Pepper, a summer when the corn came in so good their father had laughed for 3 days straight. She talked the way a person talked when they'd held something sealed up too long, and finally found the container too small to hold it anymore. Thomas listened. Occasionally he said, yeah, or I remember that, and once he laughed, a small, surprised sound, like he'd forgotten he could. Clara and Caleb stood in the hallway and didn't look at each other. After a while, the voices went quiet.
Caleb looked through the crack and saw that Thomas had fallen asleep mid-listen, the way children did, and Lily had pulled the blanket up and lay beside him, with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, finally still. Clara pulled the door gently closed. They stood in the hallway together. "She talked to you this morning," Caleb said. "She did," Clara said. "About her parents?" "Some." Clara looked at the closed door. "Mostly about Thomas, about how scared she's been. She's been pretending not to be scared for so long, she'd almost convinced herself." She paused. "She told me something else, too." Caleb waited. "She said she's been worrying about you," Clara said. She looked at him then, and her eyes were direct and a little careful. "She said you don't sleep. She noticed it at the cabin. She said she'd wake up in the night and you'd be sitting up, watching the door." Caleb said nothing. "Have you slept?" Clara asked. "Since you found them?" "Some." "How much is some?" He didn't answer. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You need to sleep," she said. "Not because I'm telling you to. Because if you collapse from exhaustion, those two children are going to be frightened in a way they absolutely do not need right now." She held his gaze. "So tonight, you sleep. I'll stay awake if one of them needs something." "Clara, I'm a light sleeper," she said, "and I'm not carrying 3 days of riding on no food. You are." She said it like it was a fact and not an argument, which made it very hard to argue with. "That's just practical." Caleb looked at her. "I'm not used to people looking after me," he said. "I noticed," she said. "We can discuss whether that's a personality trait or a circumstance another time. Tonight, sleep." He almost said something else. He could feel the shape of it, some further resistance, some instinct to maintain the distance of self-sufficiency that had been his default for longer than he could account for. But he was tired. He was bone-tired in a way that had gone past physical and into something closer to the soul. And Clara Hayes was standing in a narrow hallway, telling him the truth in the simplest way she knew how. And the truth was that he needed to let someone else stand watch for one night. "All right," he said. She nodded once. "Caleb," she said as he turned. He stopped. "What you did for those children," she said. "Riding 3 days, not leaving, walking into that room and asking the impossible." She paused. "That was a brave thing." He turned back slowly. "You were the brave one." "We can argue about that later too," she said. But there was something in her voice, something warmer than her usual precision, that stayed with him as he went. He slept. He slept for 9 hours straight, which he had not done in months, maybe years. And he woke in the thin blue light before dawn, with no idea for half a second where he was. Then it came back. The town, the children, the woman in the next room who had signed her name next to his and asked if he was kind. He lay still and listened to the building breathe around him. Through the wall, barely audible, he heard Clara moving. The soft sound of someone awake and quiet, trying not to disturb anyone. He heard the faint creak of the floorboard near the children's door and knew she'd checked on them. She had stayed awake all night. The realization moved through him slowly, and with it came something he hadn't anticipated. Something that had no clean name, that was too early and too layered to call what it might become, but was real enough that he felt it settle into his chest and stay there. In the street below, a wagon was beginning to move. A rooster started up somewhere. The town was waking. Caleb sat up, reached for his boots, and got ready to start the day. He had a family to take care of,
The word was strange. New. He turned it over in his mind the way you turned over a stone to see what was underneath, uncertain whether it would feel too heavy when he really looked at it. It didn't. It felt, in fact, like the first solid ground he'd stood on in a very long time. He pulled on his coat and opened the door and walked toward the sound of Clara in the next room, already awake, already moving, already doing what needed doing. And for reasons he was only beginning to understand, that was enough to make him walk a little steadier than he had the day before. Thomas was sitting up on his own by the fourth morning. It was a small thing. Just a boy pushing himself upright without help, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, asking if there was any biscuit left from breakfast. But Caleb stood in the doorway and watched it happen, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been pulled wire-tight since the moment he'd found those children under a burned-out wagon. "There's biscuit," Clara said from behind him. She moved past, handing Thomas a cloth-wrapped bundle and pressing the back of her wrist to his forehead in one smooth motion. The gesture was so natural, so practiced-looking, that Caleb almost said something about it. He didn't. "No fever," she said. "Told you," Thomas said, already unwrapping the biscuit. "You told me yesterday, too," Clara said. "And you had a fever." "That was yesterday." "Indeed it was." She stepped back. "Eat slowly." Thomas ate quickly. Children always did. Lily sat beside him on the bed, with her legs crossed and her hands in her lap, watching her brother eat with the specific satisfaction of someone whose greatest fear had been slowly, daily, walking itself back from the edge. It was, Caleb thought, the most ordinary thing he'd seen in weeks. He was starting to understand that ordinary was what he'd been missing, without knowing he missed it. The trouble walked in on the fifth day, wearing a badge and a self-important expression, and it came in the form of Sheriff Dale Pruitt, with a piece of paper folded in his coat pocket and two men behind him that Caleb didn't recognize. Caleb was outside the general store when he saw them coming. He watched Pruitt's walk, that particular stride of a man who'd decided something and was executing the decision before he could talk himself out of it, and knew before anyone spoke that this was not a social call. "Hunter," Pruitt said. "Sheriff." Pruitt stopped 3 feet away. He took the paper from his pocket, but didn't unfold it yet, the way a man held a card before he decided whether to play it. "Those children upstairs," he said. "The boy and the girl." "Thomas and Lily," Caleb said. "Right," Pruitt nodded slowly. "You find them north of the timberline?" "That's right." "Wagon burned out? Man and woman dead?" "You know this already," Caleb said. "I told you myself 5 days ago." "You told me some of it." Pruitt unfolded the paper. "What you didn't tell me, maybe because you didn't know, is that the family had a name. Hargrove. James and Eliza Hargrove, out of Kansas. They had a claim filed on parcels up in Summit County." He held the paper out. Caleb took it. "And James Hargrove had a brother." Caleb read the paper once, then again. "His name is Roy Hargrove," Pruitt continued. "He's been riding the territory looking for his brother's family since June. He reached Glenwood Springs 2 days ago. Got word of what happened." Pruitt paused. "He's got a letter from a circuit judge in Kansas establishing him as next of kin to those children. He's on his way here now." Caleb folded the paper. He held it in his hand and looked at it, and the morning felt like it had shifted sideways by 3 inches without moving at all. "How long?" he said. "He'll be here tomorrow," Pruitt said. "Day after at the latest." One of the men behind Pruitt shifted his weight. Caleb glanced at them. Not deputies, not anyone official. Just the kind of men who attached themselves to authority for the feeling of it. He looked back at Pruitt. "Those children don't know about this," he said. "That's not my concern," Pruitt said. "My concern is making sure the legal situation is handled correctly." "Your concern," Caleb said, keeping his voice level, "should include not walking two orphan children into another shock without warning. You can at least give me that." Pruitt had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I'm giving you until tomorrow," he said. "That's what I can give you." He took the paper back from Caleb's hand. "I'd suggest you get yourself a lawyer. Hayes, Clara Hayes, your wife." He said the word with a faint stress that was not quite disrespect, but was close enough to it. "She's a smart woman. She'll know who to talk to." He walked away. Caleb stood in the street and let the news settle into him like cold water. He'd spent 5 days building something fragile and new, some approximation of stability, some first draft of a life. And now someone was coming with a letter from a judge to unmake it. And the worst part, the part Caleb couldn't argue around, was that Roy Hargrove had every legal right in the world to walk into that room and tell those children they were leaving. He went to Clara. He found her in the room she used in the evenings, sitting at her small table with a book open in front of her that she wasn't reading, because she'd heard him coming down the hall, and she already knew from the sound of his footsteps that something had changed. He told her. He told her the whole thing, flat and plain, and he watched her face while he did. She didn't react much on the outside. That was her way. But he'd learned enough in 5 days to see the tells, the small tightening around her eyes, the way her hands went still in her lap. When he finished, she said, "Did you know they were named Hargrove?" "I knew their last name. Lily told me their second night at the cabin. I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't think to report it anywhere. I was focused on getting them to a doctor." "That's not a criticism," she said quickly. "I'm just trying to understand what Roy Hargrove would know." "He'd know his brother had 2 children," Caleb said. "He'd know the wagon route they were taking. He's been looking since June, which means he cares enough to look." Clara nodded slowly. "Which means he might be a good man." Caleb looked at her. "Yeah." "Which would make this harder," she said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went to the window, and she put her hand flat against the frame and looked out at the street below. "They don't know him," she said. "No." "They've been through enough upheaval to last a decade. Sending them off with a stranger—" She stopped herself. "But he's not a stranger. He's family." "So are we," Caleb said. "On paper." She turned from the window. "On paper," she repeated. Her voice was careful. "What are you saying?" He wasn't sure yet what he was saying. He held her gaze and tried to find the honest version of it. "I'm saying I don't think paper is what matters here. I think what matters is what those children need, and I think you and I both know that what they need isn't to be handed off again. What they need and what the law allows aren't the same thing," Clara said. "I know that. And if Roy Hargrove is a decent man with a judge's letter—" "I know," Caleb said again, sharper this time, and then quieter. "I know. I'm not asking you to break any laws. I'm asking you to help me figure out if there's a way to do this right." He paused. "Is there a lawyer in this town?" "Patterson, on 2nd Street, she said. "He's competent. Fair." She was already moving, picking up her shawl from the chair. "I'll go now." "Clara." She stopped at the door. He said, "Don't tell the children yet." "I wasn't going to," she said. And she went. He told them that evening. He'd spent the afternoon arguing with himself about whether to wait, whether one more night of ordinary was worth the shape of the conversation that was coming.
And in the end, he decided that these children had been lied to by silence enough times already. They deserved the truth from him before they heard it from someone else. He sat them both down on Thomas's bed, Thomas still pale but upright, Lily cross-legged beside him, and he told them, as plainly and as gently as he knew how. Their Uncle Roy was alive and looking for them. He was coming to town. He had the right, in the eyes of the law, to take them home with him. Thomas went very still. Lily said, "Do we have to go?" "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "Clara and I are working on that." Thomas said, "Did he know our parents?" "He's your father's brother," Caleb said. "So yes." Thomas thought about that. Something moved across his face that Caleb couldn't entirely read. Part hope, part fear, part something that looked like the specific grief of a child who still had questions only a family member could answer. "Is he a good man?" Lily asked. "I don't know him," Caleb said honestly. "I've never met him." "But you'd find out," Lily said. It wasn't a question. "Before anything is decided," Caleb said, "yes, I'll find out." Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Thomas. Something passed between them in that sibling way that didn't need words. The shorthand of two people who had been each other's entire world for weeks. Thomas looked up. "We don't want to go," he said. The words hit Caleb somewhere he hadn't been prepared for. He kept his face steady. "I hear you," he said. "And that matters. What you want matters." He leaned forward, arms on his knees, holding Thomas's gaze. "But I won't lie to you about how this works. The law has a say. Your uncle has a say. What I can promise you is that Clara and I will fight for what's right for you. Not what's easy, what's right." "What if what's right and what we want aren't the same?" Thomas asked. 8 years old, Caleb thought. 8 years old and asking that question. "Then we figure that out together," Caleb said. "All of us, including you." Roy Hargrove arrived the following afternoon. He was younger than Caleb had expected. Late 30s, lean, trail-worn in the way of a man who'd been moving hard for weeks. He had James Hargrove's eyes, apparently, because Lily recognized them the second she saw him from across the street and grabbed Caleb's sleeve without saying a word. Caleb looked down at her hand, then up at Roy Hargrove. Pruitt made the introductions outside the sheriff's office with the formality of a man who wanted everything documented. Roy Hargrove shook Caleb's hand and looked at him with an expression that was complicated, grateful, wary, assessing. "Mr. Hunter," he said, "I understand you found them." "I did." "And took care of them." "I tried." Roy's jaw worked. "I want to thank you for that," he said. "I've been looking since June. I thought—" He stopped. He looked away briefly, and when he looked back, his eyes were steady, but red at the rims. "I thought I was too late. The boy nearly didn't make it," Caleb said, not unkindly. "But he did." Roy nodded. I heard about the doctor. And about—" he glanced at Pruitt. "About the marriage." A pause. "My wife made that possible," Caleb said. "Without her, Thomas wouldn't have gotten treatment in time." Roy looked at him carefully. "What are your intentions?" he asked. "Toward the children." "To raise them," Caleb said, "if they want to be raised by us, and if the law allows." Roy was quiet for a moment. "And if it doesn't?" "Then I'll work until the law does," Caleb said, "or until someone convinces me there's a better way." Roy Hargrove looked at him for a long time. He was a man taking a measure, and Caleb let him do it,
without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. "I want to see them," Roy said. "I figured," Caleb said. "Come on." He brought Roy to the room where Thomas was resting and Lily was sitting, and he stayed in the doorway while the meeting happened. He'd told Clara beforehand, and she stood beside Caleb, close enough that he could feel the tension in her without having to look. Thomas saw Roy and went absolutely still. Roy crossed the room slowly, crouched down to the boy's level, the same way Caleb had crouched in that doctor's office, and said, quietly, "Hey, Thomas." Thomas stared at him. "You've got your daddy's jaw," Roy said. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Thomas's face crumpled. He pressed his lips together hard, fighting it, and then stopped fighting it. Roy put his arms around the boy carefully, minding the ribs, and Thomas grabbed onto him the way drowning people grabbed onto solid things, and cried. Lily stood up from her chair. She walked to Roy slowly, studying him the whole way, and when she was close enough, she said, "You look like Papa around the eyes." Roy looked at her over Thomas's shoulder. "I know," he said rough. He always said the same. "He liked that you had the same eyes," Lily said. "He said it meant he had you close, even when you were far." Roy closed his eyes. Clara turned away from the door. Caleb heard the small sound she made, barely anything, barely audible, and didn't say a word. He just found her hand in the space between them and held it. She let him. The meeting with Patterson, the lawyer, happened the next morning. Caleb and Clara on one side of the table, Roy Hargrove on the other, Patterson at the head with papers in front of him and the particular practiced neutrality of a man paid to hold two sides' interests simultaneously. "Mr. Hargrove has prior legal claim as next of kin," Patterson said. "The judge's letter is valid, and the circuit court would recognize it." He looked at Caleb. "The marriage complicates things, but it doesn't override blood claim in this jurisdiction." "What would change that?" Clara asked. "A counter petition for guardianship, filed in the same circuit court. It would require testimony about the children's welfare, living situation, the fitness of both parties." Patterson took his spectacles off and set them on the table. "It would also require time. Months, potentially." "I'm not fighting you for them," Roy said. He said it to Caleb, not to Patterson, and his voice was flat and direct. "I want to make that clear. I didn't ride this far to drag two traumatized children through a legal battle." Caleb looked at him. "Then what did you ride this far for?" Roy was quiet for a moment. "To make sure they're alive," he said. "To make sure they're safe. And to figure out what James would have wanted." He folded his hands on the table. "My brother was a careful man. He thought about things from every side before he decided. If he could see where those children ended up," he paused, "he'd want to know they were with people who chose them, not people who inherited them." "We chose them," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but without any give in it. "Both of us." Roy looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. "I watched the way the girl looked at you this morning. Children don't look at people like that unless they've been given a reason to." Clara said nothing. Caleb noticed she pressed her hand flat on the table in front of her. A small, steadying gesture, barely visible. "What I want," Roy said, "is to be part of their lives. Their uncle. Someone they can come to when they have questions about their parents, their history, where they come from." He looked at Caleb. "I'm not their father. I know that. I'm not trying to be." His jaw tightened. "But I am the only piece of James Hargrove left in this world. And I'm not willing to disappear from those children's lives just because a stranger found them first." The word stranger landed in the room quietly. Not as an attack. Roy's tone made that clear. But it was true. and it sat between all of them like an honest thing that nobody wanted to pick up. Caleb looked at it. Let it be true. Then said, "What are you proposing?" Roy reached into his coat and took out a piece of paper. Not the judge's letter this time. Something handwritten. Several lines. He set it in the center of the table. "I wrote this last night," he said. "I want the children to stay with you. I want it legal and clear and binding. I want my claim waived in exchange for recognized uncle's rights, visits, correspondence, the ability to tell them about their parents when they're old enough to want to know." He looked at Patterson. "Can that be written into a legal agreement?" Patterson looked at the paper. He looked at both sides of the table. "Yes," he said, "it can." The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at the paper. He looked at Roy Hargrove, this road-worn man with his brother's children's eyes, who had ridden half the territory looking for family and found them already held by strangers and chosen to honor that rather than fight it. "Why?" Caleb asked. Roy met his eyes. "Because James would have done the same thing," he said simply. "If it had been my children." His voice was even, but his hands were tight on the table.
My brother was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and trust that people were decent. I used to think that was a weakness." He looked at Thomas and Lily through the open door, visible at the end of the hall. "I don't think that anymore." The silence stretched long enough to mean something. Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Roy. "Get the paperwork drawn up," Caleb said to Patterson. He extended his hand to Roy across the table. "We'll want you at dinner when it's signed, so Thomas and Lily can see this is a good thing, not a loss." Roy Hargrove looked at the hand. Something moved through his face, a kind of careful relief, the specific exhale of a man who'd braced himself for a fight, and was only now accepting that there wouldn't be one. He shook it. "That's a decent thing," Roy said. "Trying," Caleb said. The papers were signed by late afternoon. Thomas and Lily sat through the signing at Patterson's table with the solemn attention of children who understood that something important was being decided around them, even if not all the words made sense. When it was over, Thomas looked at Roy and said, "So you're staying?" "For a few days," Roy said. "Then I've got to get back to Kansas. I've got a farm." "Could we visit?" Lily asked. Roy looked at Caleb and Clara. Caleb nodded once. "Yes," Roy said. "You could visit." Lily thought about this. "Did Papa grow up on your farm?" "He did, till he was about 16. "What was he like when he was my age?" Roy Hargrove, a man who had ridden 300 miles, waived the legal claim, and shaken hands with the stranger who'd taken his brother's children, looked at the 6-year-old girl with her terrible braid and her steady eyes, and something in his face broke open and rebuilt itself, all in the space of a second. He was stubborn, Roy said, and curious about everything, and he could make anybody laugh when he wanted to. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that carried a long way behind it. "You've got that last one, I think." Lily looked at him. "Mama said the same thing," she said, "about me and Papa." "Well," Roy said quietly, "your mama was a smart woman." "I know," Lily said. And she reached out and took his hand, the way children did when they'd decided about a person. And Roy Hargrove held on like it was something precious, which it was. Caleb watched from across the room. Clara stood beside him, close enough now that it was a choice, not an accident. And she said, very softly, "You handled that well." "Roy did most of the work," Caleb said. "You let him," she said. "That matters too." He looked at her sideways. "You're still counting what I do right." "Someone should," she said, not softly, not sentimentally, just as a fact.
the way she said most true things. He looked back at the room, at Thomas, leaning forward to hear Roy talk, at Lily, still holding Roy's hand, at the paperwork drying on Patterson's desk that said, in the language the law understood, "These children have a home, and it is here." He had ridden into this town 6 days ago with blood on his shirt and a dying child in his arms, and nothing to offer but the willingness to ask an impossible thing. 6 days. He didn't know yet what the months ahead looked like, the learning curve of fatherhood, the strangeness of a marriage built from the outside in, the long work of becoming a family rather than just a group of people tied together by circumstance. He didn't know if Clara would grow to resent the life she'd stepped into, or if he would find himself equal to what these children needed, or if Harlan's Creek would ever look at them as anything other than a strange arrangement built out of necessity. What he knew was this: the boy was alive. The girl was talking. The uncle was holding her hand instead of a court order. And the woman beside him, his wife, that strange word, that real word, had stayed awake all night to let him sleep, and had walked into a lawyer's office ready to fight, and was standing close enough now that he could feel her steadiness, the way you felt solid ground after too long on uncertain terrain. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything he'd asked for when he'd walked into a saloon and said the most desperate thing he'd ever said out loud. And it was more than he'd expected to receive. Roy Hargrove left on the Thursday morning. He shook Caleb's hand at the edge of town, held Lily for a long time without saying anything, and told Thomas to write him when he learned how. Thomas said he already knew how. Roy laughed, and for just a second, Clara saw something in his face that must have been James Hargrove, the echo of a man she'd never met, but felt she knew something of now, living in the jawline and the laugh of his brother. Then Roy rode south, and the four of them stood in the street and watched him go. And that was the end of the crisis portion of things. What came after was harder in different ways. Crisis, Caleb had learned, had a clarifying quality to it. When everything was urgent, the choices were simple. Ride faster, ask louder, hold on tighter. There was no room for uncertainty because there was no time for it. You did the next necessary thing and the next one after that, and you didn't stop to wonder if you were doing any of it right. But now Thomas was walking on his own. Lily was eating full meals. The legal papers were filed, and the rooms above the general store were paid through the end of the month. The crisis was over, and Caleb Hunter, who had known exactly what to do in every emergency for the past 2 weeks, stood in the middle of ordinary life and had absolutely no idea how to live in it. The first real argument happened over a chair. It was a stupid thing, the kind of thing that wasn't about the chair at all, but needed the chair to get started. Caleb had brought a chair up from the storeroom without asking, a sturdy wooden one that he thought Thomas could use while he was still recovering, and he'd set it by the window in the main room without thinking. Clara came in, saw it, and her face did something small and controlled that Caleb had learned to pay attention to. "That's Mr. Finch's chair," she said. "I asked him," Caleb said. "He said it was fine." "You asked Mr. Finch before you said anything to me." Caleb stopped. "It's a chair." "It's our living space," she said. And the correction she made in the middle of that sentence was the real thing, the thing that carried the weight. She looked at the chair, then at him. "I'm not saying you did wrong to ask him. I'm saying, in the future, if you want to change something in this space, ask me first." "Clara, it's a chair." "Caleb," her voice was patient and slightly strained, the voice of a woman holding two competing impulses in check at once. "I have lived alone for 2 years. I have arranged my life in a particular way for reasons that are mine.
You have been here for 10 days. I am adjusting. I need you to adjust with me instead of around me." He looked at her. Then he looked at the chair. "You want me to take it back?" "No," she said. "Thomas needs somewhere to sit. Leave the chair." She picked up her book from the table. "Just ask me next time." He stood there for a moment. "All right," he said. "I will." She nodded and sat down. He thought that was the end of it. He went to check on Thomas, and when he came back through the main room 20 minutes later, Clara was still at the table. But she wasn't reading. The book was open, and she was staring at the wall with the specific expression of a person having an argument with themselves. Caleb sat down across from her. She looked up. "I'm not upset about the chair," she said. "I know." "I'm upset because—" She stopped. She closed the book. "I made a very large decision very quickly, and I stand by it. But standing by it and having it be easy are not the same thing." "No," Caleb agreed. "They're not." "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I've never done it. I know how to teach children who go home to someone else at the end of the day. I know how to live alone and manage my own life. I do not know how to share a life with someone I met 11 days ago." "I don't either," Caleb said. She looked at him. "You're not making me feel better." "I'm not trying to make you feel better," he said. "I'm trying to be honest with you. Because you asked me on the first day to be kind, and I figure honesty is part of that." He leaned forward. "I don't know how to do any of this, Clara. I don't know how to be a husband, or a father, or a person who lives in a town. What I know is how to learn things that are hard, and I know how to try." He paused. "That's all I've got." Clara looked at him for a long time. "That's more than nothing," she said finally. "It is," he agreed. She opened her book again. He stayed at the table. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was different from before. Less pressurized, more like two people in the same room, breathing the same air, and finding it acceptable. It wasn't closeness yet, but it was the beginning of the practice of it. Harlan's Creek had opinions, and it shared them freely. The woman from the post office, Mrs. Aldrich, stopped Clara on the street 12 days in and asked, with the particular sweetness of someone who wanted information and had wrapped it in concern, how things were going at home. Clara said fine, thank you. Mrs. Aldrich said she'd heard the children were recovering well, and that was wonderful, and that she'd heard Mr. Hunter had been seen going in and out of the general store at odd hours, which, she supposed, was just his way. Clara looked at her. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said pleasantly, "if there's something you'd like to ask me directly, I prefer you do that." Mrs. Aldrich blinked. My husband keeps odd hours because he spent years on a mountain range, where the day started before dawn and ended when the work was done. It's a habit, not a problem." Clara adjusted the basket on her arm. "Was there anything else?" Mrs. Aldrich said no and walked away looking slightly flattened. Clara told Caleb about it that evening while they were washing up after supper, and he laughed, an actual laugh, short and genuine, the kind he didn't give out often. She looked at him sideways when it happened and felt something in her chest do a small, unexpected thing. "You handled that well," he said. "I've had practice," she said. She handed him a dish to dry. "The town will settle. They always do. Once the gossip runs out of new material, people move on to the next thing." "And if they don't?" "Then we stop caring what they think, and they get used to that too." She handed him another dish. "You've been on a mountain for years, Caleb. You don't strike me as someone who loses sleep over other people's opinions." "I don't," he said. "I'm more concerned with yours." She stopped washing. She didn't turn around for a moment. She stood at the basin with her hands in the water and let that sentence land the way it needed to land. Then she turned. He was drying the dish with the kind of focus a man used when he'd said something true and was waiting to see what the truth cost him. "My opinion," she said carefully, "is still being formed." "That's fair," he said. It's not negative," she said, which was not something she'd planned to say, and she could feel the surprise of her own honesty as the words came out. "I want to be clear about that. It's just incomplete." He looked at her. "How can I help it along?" "You're already doing it," she said, and then, because she didn't quite know where to put that, she turned back to the basin and kept washing. Thomas had a nightmare 3 nights in. Caleb heard it first, a sharp cry from the children's room, then silence, then the low, broken sound of a child surfacing from something terrible, and not quite knowing how to come all the way back. He was up before he'd finished thinking about it, across the hall, through the door. Thomas was sitting up, shaking, hands gripping the blanket. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. "Hey," he said. "I'm here." Thomas looked at him. His eyes were still half somewhere else. "I dreamed about the wagon," he said. "I figured," Caleb said. "I couldn't get Lily out. In the dream, I couldn't—" His voice broke. He pressed his mouth shut, hard. Caleb put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Steady. Present. "But you did," he said. "In the real one, you did. You held on to her the whole time." "She held on to me, too," Thomas said. "I know." Thomas looked at him with those grave eyes that had seen too much. "Do you have nightmares?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "About what?" He thought about it. "About not getting there in time," he said. "About riding up and finding you'd already—" He stopped. He hadn't said this out loud before. Hadn't even fully let himself think it. "Yeah, sometimes about that." Thomas stared at him. "You're scared too," he said. It wasn't an accusation, more like a discovery. "Everybody's scared of something," Caleb said. "Being scared doesn't mean you don't do the thing." Thomas considered this. "Papa used to say being brave isn't not being scared. It's doing it anyway." "Your papa was right," Caleb said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Clara appeared in the doorway. She'd woken too, silently, and stood there now in the dark hall. Caleb saw her, but Thomas hadn't turned around yet. "Caleb?" Thomas said. "Yeah?" "Can I call you—" He stopped, swallowed. "Is it okay if I call you something besides Caleb?" The room was very still. Caleb looked at this boy, 8 years old, newly alive, barely 2 weeks out from the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and he understood the weight of what was being asked. Not a small thing, not a word on paper thing, a real thing, the kind that stayed. "What did you want to call me?" Caleb asked. Thomas looked at his hands. "I don't know if I should say it yet," he said. "It might be too soon." "You can say it whenever you're ready," Caleb said. "There's no wrong time." Thomas nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Not yet, but soon." "Okay," Caleb said. "Get some sleep." He got Thomas settled, and when he stepped into the hall, Clara was there, and she looked at him in the thin light with an expression that had nothing careful in it, nothing managed, just full and unguarded and very serious. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She turned back to her room. He stood in the hall for a moment, then went back to his cot, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the building settle.
The school board came the following week. There were 3 of them: Henderson, who chaired the board, a man named Greer, and a woman named Mrs. Voss, who wore her disapproval like a second coat. They came to the rooms above the general store on a Wednesday morning while Caleb was out getting lumber. He'd taken on some carpentry work, the kind of thing that kept his hands busy and brought in enough to not have to touch his savings. And when he came back, Clara was at her table with her hands flat in front of her, and that math problem expression on her face. "Who is here?" he said. "The board." She looked up. "They've decided that my domestic situation raises questions about my suitability as a teacher." He set down the lumber, slowly. "What questions?" "The nature of the marriage, the presence of 2 children, the haste of it all." Her voice was level. It was doing the work of keeping something else in check. Mrs. Voss, in particular, feels that a woman in an irregular arrangement is not an appropriate model for the town's children. Caleb stared at her. "They're threatening your position. They gave me 2 weeks to, and I'm quoting, demonstrate that the situation is stable and conventional." She pressed her lips together. "Whatever that means." "It means they want us to look the part," Caleb said. "Yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The chair he'd brought up without asking. He thought about that briefly. "What do you want to do?" Clara looked at him with surprise, not because it was the wrong question, but because she hadn't expected it to be the first question. "I want to keep my position," she said. "I am a good teacher. Better than anyone else they could put in that room on the budget they're working with, and they know it." Her jaw was tight. "I will not pretend to be something I'm not, but I'm not willing to lose this job because of a handful of people who've decided a fast marriage is a scandal." "It was fast," Caleb said. "It was necessary," she said. "Those are not the same." "No," he agreed. He thought for a moment. "Henderson, he's a practical man?" "He can be." "Then I'll talk to him." Clara straightened. "Caleb." "Not to threaten him," he said. "Not to argue. To let him see what this actually is." He held her gaze. "He's never talked to me. All he has is what the town's been saying. Let me go correct that." She studied him. "You're willing to do that?" "I don't love talking to people," he said. "But for things that matter, I do what's necessary." He stood up. "You stayed awake all night so I could sleep. You walked into a lawyer's office ready to fight for those children before you'd known them a week. You stood up in a room full of people laughing and answered a question nobody else would answer." He picked up his hat. "The least I can do is have a conversation." Clara watched him walk to the door. "Caleb?" He turned. "Thank you," she said. Just that, quiet and real. He nodded once and went. He found Henderson at the feed store, which was where practical men in Harlan's Creek tended to do their actual thinking. Henderson was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with calloused hands and the look of someone who'd built his own house twice. He saw Caleb coming and didn't quite manage to look unsurprised. "Hunter," he said. "Mr. Henderson." Caleb stopped, didn't extend his hand, didn't take his hat off, just stood level and met the man's eyes. "You were at my wife's rooms this morning." "I was," Henderson said, no apology in it. "Then let me tell you something you weren't told this morning," Caleb said. "Because you're hearing this situation through other people's mouths, and I think you deserve to hear it from mine." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply spoke, steady and plain. "I rode 3 days on no sleep to get a dying child to a doctor. Your town's law said I needed a legal guardian to authorize treatment." Clara Hayes was the only person in a room of 15 who stood up. He paused. "Not because she's reckless, Not because she's lost her judgment. Because she looked at a child who was dying and made the only decent choice available. He let that sit for a moment. The marriage is real. The children are in her care. She gets up earlier than anyone on that street. She keeps those rooms clean. She makes sure those children eat and sleep and learn. And she teaches your town's children 6 days a week in between. Another pause. If that's irregular, Mr. Henderson, then you ought to think carefully about what you're calling regular. Henderson looked at him for a long time. Mrs. Voss has concerns, he said. Mrs. Voss has opinions, Caleb said. That's different. Henderson's mouth twitched, very slightly. You're not much for diplomacy. No, sir, Caleb said, but I'm straight about things. And straight about this. My wife is the best thing that's happened to those children, and probably to me. You pull her position, you're punishing a woman for being decent. I don't think that's what you intend to do. Henderson was quiet. Come to dinner, Caleb said. Thursday. Bring your wife. See for yourself what this actually looks like. Henderson blinked. You're inviting me to dinner. I'm inviting you to use your own eyes, Caleb said, instead of other people's. There was a long pause. Thursday, Henderson said. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, Caleb agreed. He walked back. He told Clara when he got in. She stared at him. You invited the school board chairman to dinner? She said. One of them, Caleb said. The one who matters. In 2 days. Gives us time to prepare. Caleb, I cannot. She stopped, started again. I cook adequately. I am not a... Lily knows her mother's cornbread recipe, Caleb said. Thomas has been asking to help with something for a week, and I haven't found him a task yet. And I can manage a roast, if you tell me what temperature you want. He hung up his hat. Let's not overcomplicate it. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face shifted. The tight-held control loosening by one precise degree. Enough to let through something that looked close to affection, or the early precursor to it. You negotiated a dinner party out of a threat to my livelihood, she said. I negotiated a chance for a man to see the truth, he said. The dinner part was practical. You are an unusual person, she said. You signed your name next to mine, he said. You already knew that. She almost smiled. Then she went to the kitchen and started making a list, because that was what Clara Hayes did when she'd accepted a thing. She moved immediately toward whatever came next, and she organized it, and she made it work. Caleb watched her for a moment. Then he went to find Thomas and Lily and tell them they were having a guest Thursday, and everyone needed to be on their best behavior, which Thomas took seriously, and Lily took as a personal challenge. Thursday came fast. The dinner was not elegant. The cornbread was lopsided because Lily had added too much in the middle and not enough on the sides, which she announced proudly before anyone could mention it. Thomas had peeled the potatoes with the intense focus of someone performing surgery, and there were one or two that were more peel than potato. Caleb's roast was cooked right through and seasoned with the slightly uncertain hand of a man who mostly ate simply. Henderson and his wife sat at the small table in the main room, the same room where the argument about the chair had happened, where Clara did her reading at night, where Lily had started practicing letters on the back of old papers Clara brought home from school. It was nothing fancy, but it was real. Henderson watched Thomas correct Lily's table manners with the patient exasperation of an older sibling. He watched Lily ignore the correction and then do the thing anyway 2 minutes later, because she'd decided it was her own idea. He watched Clara explain something to Henderson's wife about the school curriculum with the clear enthusiasm of a woman who genuinely loved her work. He watched Caleb pour water for everyone before sitting, and pull out Clara's chair without ceremony, and eat the lopsided cornbread without a word of complaint. After dinner, while Clara and Mrs. Henderson talked in the corner, and the children had been sent to wash up. Henderson leaned back in his chair and said quietly to Caleb, "My first wife died young." Caleb looked at him. "I raised my daughter alone for 4 years before I met Margaret," Henderson said. People had plenty to say about that, too. He looked at the table. Fast arrangements, necessity marriages, they look one way from outside. From inside, they're just people trying to take care of each other. He paused. "She'll have her position." Caleb nodded. "Thank you." "Thank your wife," Henderson said. "She's the one who earned it." Clara found out when Henderson's formal letter arrived 2 days later, confirming her contract for the coming school year. She read it at the table, and then she set it down very carefully, and she looked at Caleb across the room. "You did this," she said. "Henderson did it," Caleb said. "He made his own choice." "You gave him the chance to." He shrugged. "You'd have found a way without me." "Maybe," she said, "but not as fast." She looked at the letter again. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" She looked up. "I want you to know—" She stopped. Started again. She was not a woman who fumbled words, but she fumbled these a little, and he found that he valued that. "What you said to me that first day, that you don't leave what you choose to protect." She held his gaze. "I believe you." He looked at her across the room. "Good," he said. "It took me a while," she admitted. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not easy to read." "No," she agreed. "But you're consistent." And that, she seemed to be finding the precise word. "Consistency is more than I've been given before. It matters." He held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. "Same," he said. One word, but she heard everything in it, and he knew she did, because Clara Hayes heard what was underneath things. She always had. She folded the letter and put it in her book for safekeeping, and they went about the rest of the evening the way they'd been going about evenings for 3 weeks now. Caleb mending something near the lamp, Clara reading, the children's voices drifting through the wall in the warm last light of August, ordinary and real and theirs. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. But plans, Caleb had come to understand, were just the things you held onto before life handed you something better. September came in quietly, the way good things often did. The heat broke on a Monday. Not dramatically, not with a storm, just a morning where the air felt different when Caleb pushed open the window before dawn and something cooler moved through the room like the world exhaling. He stood there for a moment and breathed it in, and behind him he heard Lily's voice from the hallway asking if it was fall yet, and Thomas telling her it wasn't fall, it was just less summer, and Lily saying that was the same thing, and Thomas saying it absolutely was not. Caleb almost smiled. He'd been almost smiling a lot lately. He hadn't decided yet what to do about that. School had started the week before. Clara was back in her classroom 6 days a week with the focused energy of a woman returned to her natural element. And she came home in the evenings with chalk dust on her sleeves and the specific satisfied tiredness of someone who'd used herself well. Lily had been enrolled. She'd walked in on the first morning, holding Thomas's hand, even though Thomas was not in her class, released it at the door with great dignity, and walked inside without looking back. Thomas had watched her go and said, "She's going to be fine." "I know," Caleb said. "She's braver than she looks," Thomas said. "Most people are," Caleb said. Thomas had looked up at him then, with those old, young eyes. "Are you?" Caleb had thought about it honestly. "I'm working on it," he said. Thomas had nodded like that was the correct answer, and they'd walked back together, and that had been that. The letter from Roy arrived on a Wednesday. 3 weeks after he'd ridden south. Thomas read it at the table, while Clara watched from across the room with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, trying to look like she wasn't watching. Lily sat beside Thomas, chin on his shoulder, reading along even though she was slower than him and had to ask twice what certain words meant. When Thomas finished, he folded the letter carefully, the way Roy had folded his papers at the lawyer's table, and he set it down. "He wants to know if we'd visit at Christmas," Thomas said. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. Thomas thought about it. "I want to see the farm," he said, "where Papa grew up." He paused. "Is that okay?" "It's more than okay," Clara said. "We'd all go?" Lily asked. "All 4 of us," Caleb said. Lily considered the logistics of this. "That's a long ride," she said. "It is," Caleb agreed. "Will you teach me to ride properly before then?" she asked. "Not just holding on behind you, actually ride?" Caleb looked at her, 6 years old, sitting there like she was scheduling a business meeting. "Yes," he said. "I'll teach you." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to her breakfast. Thomas wrote his reply that afternoon, sitting at Clara's small table, with Clara's good pen, his tongue between his teeth, composing with the seriousness of someone who understood that some words needed to be gotten right. When he finished, he brought it to Caleb. "Will you check it?" he asked. Caleb read it. It was clear and warm, and 3 sentences longer than it needed to be, which was exactly right. "It's good," Caleb said. "Send it." Thomas took it to the post office himself, walking the 4 blocks alone for the first time since they'd come to town, and came back looking an inch taller. The problem that had been building for 2 weeks announced itself on a Friday afternoon, which was, Caleb had learned, when problems in towns tended to arrive. Late enough in the week that they ruined the weekend, early enough that there was still time to make it worse. It started with Pruitt. The sheriff came to the lumberyard, where Caleb had been working 3 days a week for the past month, doing carpentry for a man named Cole, who built furniture and had more orders than hands. Caleb saw Pruitt coming from 20 yards out and felt the specific weight that settled in him whenever the sheriff appeared. Not fear, just the readiness of a man who'd learned that Dale Pruitt rarely showed up with good news. "Hotter," Pruitt said. "Sheriff?" Caleb set down the plane he was using and straightened. "What is it?" Pruitt had a piece of paper. He always seemed to have a piece of paper. "I got a complaint filed this morning," he said. "Against you." Caleb waited. "Jacob Marsh," Pruitt said, "claims you threatened him 2 days ago outside the feed store." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I didn't threaten Jacob Marsh." "He says otherwise." "What does he claim I said?" Pruitt looked at the paper. "That you told him to watch his mouth or you'd make him regret it." "I told him," Caleb said, "that speaking about my wife the way he was speaking about her in a public street was something a decent man wouldn't do. I didn't touch him. I didn't raise my voice." His jaw was tight. "What was he saying about her?" Pruitt had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. According to him, he was just, "What was he saying, Dale?" Pruitt exhaled through his nose. He was telling a group of men that a woman who'd marry a stranger for money wasn't the kind of woman who should be teaching children values. He folded the paper. "Those are his words, not mine." Caleb stood very still. "The complaint," he said. "Is it formal? Does it go anywhere?" "It could," Pruitt said, "if Marsh pushes it. A formal complaint against a man with 2 children and a wife in a public position." He left the rest of it in the air. Caleb understood. It wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what it could be made to look like. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. "Honestly? Nothing. Let it sit. Marsh is a small man looking for leverage he doesn't have, And if you leave it alone, it'll go away." He paused. "But I thought you should know." "Does Clara know?" "Not from me," Pruitt said. Caleb nodded once. "All right." Pruitt turned to go, then stopped. "Hunter," he turned back. "For what it's worth, what Marsh said, most of the town doesn't think it." Caleb looked at him. "Most," he said. "Most," Pruitt confirmed. "It's a start," he told Clara. He told her that evening, after the children were in bed, sitting at the table in the quiet that the rooms got after 9 o'clock, when Lily's questions finally ran out and Thomas's reading finally put him to sleep. He told her plainly and completely, including what Marsh had said about her, because he had decided long ago that she deserved the truth, even when it was ugly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did you say to him, exactly?" He told her. She was quiet again. Then, "That's not a threat." "I didn't think so either." "That's a man telling another man to behave decently." She looked at her hands on the table. "Jacob Marsh has been looking for a reason to make this difficult since the week we married. He doesn't like that I turned down his brother's courtship 2 years ago." She said it flatly, not with drama, just information. "This is about that." Caleb stared at her. "His brother courted you." "Briefly," she said. "He wasn't unkind, he just wasn't—" She paused, choosing words. "He wanted a wife who would reduce herself, fit smaller than she was. I couldn't do that." She looked up. "So I said no. And Jacob Marsh has held that against you." "Small men often do," she said, not bitterly, just as a fact of the world she'd navigated for long enough to stop being surprised by it. Caleb looked at her across the table. "I'm not going to let him use me to hurt you," he said. "Pruitt says to leave it alone, and I think Pruitt's right. But if Marsh files formally, then we deal with it formally," Clara said. "Patterson knows us now. The board gave me my contract back. Henderson will speak for us if we need him to." She met his eyes. "We are not as alone as we were 5 weeks ago, Caleb." He registered that. We. Not I, not you. We. He wasn't sure she'd noticed she'd said it that way. He didn't point it out. He just held it quietly, the way you held things that were new and true and not quite ready to be spoken about directly. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Then Clara said, "Were you defending me when you talked to Marsh?" "Yes," Caleb said. "You didn't tell me first," she said. But her voice was different from the chair conversation, softer, less corrective. "No," he said. "It happened on the street. There wasn't time." He paused. "Should I have walked away?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I don't think so." She looked at him. "I just want to know when these things happen. Not so I can manage you. So I'm not walking into town not knowing what shape the ground is." "Fair," he said. "I'll tell you." "Thank you." She stood up and began clearing the cups from the table. She worked with her back to him for a moment, and then she said, quietly, "No one's done that before. Stood up for me like that." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said what was true. "They should have." She didn't respond, but her hands went still for just a moment before she kept moving, and he saw it, and he understood that some things didn't need a reply. Thomas called him Pa on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of September. He didn't make an event of it. He didn't announce it or work up to it or ask permission the way he'd hinted he might weeks earlier. He was at the table eating,
and Caleb came through the door from running an errand, and Thomas looked up and said, "Pa, did you remember the flower?" Caleb stopped. The word hit him somewhere he hadn't defended, which was the only place words like that could hit. He stood in the doorway with the flower and the morning light behind him and looked at this boy. This boy he'd found under a wagon. This boy he'd carried 3 days on no sleep. This boy who'd said thank you before he'd said anything else. And his throat closed completely. "Yeah," he said. "Got it." He set it on the counter. He stood at the counter for a moment with his back to the room. Thomas said, "Are you okay?" "Fine," Caleb said. His voice came out rough. He cleared it. "Just fine," he heard Lily say from somewhere behind him. "He's not fine. He's doing the face." "What face?" Thomas asked. "The face where his jaw gets tight and he looks at something that isn't there," Lily said, with the authority of a child who had studied her subject carefully. "He does it when something matters." Caleb turned around. Lily was watching him with those grave, steady eyes, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "You're too observant," he told her. "You told me to pay attention," she said. "I'm paying attention." He looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking back at him with the careful hope of a child who'd taken a risk and was waiting to find out if it had landed wrong. His hands were wrapped around his cup, and his shoulders were slightly tight, and he was 8 years old, and braver than he had any right to be. "Thomas," Caleb said. "Yeah? I'm glad you said that." Thomas exhaled, slow and long, like he'd been holding it. "Okay," he said. "Good." He looked back at his breakfast. "Can I have more?" Caleb almost laughed. He pushed off the counter and got the boy more breakfast, and the morning went on, and that was how it happened. Not with ceremony, not with speeches, with a word over a bowl of oatmeal, and the child asking for seconds. Clara heard it from the hallway. She'd been on her way in and had stopped just outside the door, and when Caleb glanced over later, she was gone. But he found her in the side room with her back to him, one hand flat on the wall, the other pressed to her mouth, and she turned when she heard him, and her eyes were red. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "Good," she said. She straightened. She breathed. "Good." He stood there. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "How are you?" he asked. Not about this moment, not about Thomas, not about the morning. How are you? The real question, the one he'd been building toward for weeks, the one that asked about all of it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since he'd known her, she answered it without preparing the answer first. "Surprised," she said. "I'm surprised." She searched his face. "I made a decision that day in the saloon that I thought I understood completely. I thought, this is a practical thing, a decent thing, a necessary thing. And I can do necessary things without expecting them to become—" She stopped. "I didn't expect it to become something I wanted to protect." The room was very still. "And now?" he said. "Now I'm protecting it," she said simply. "That's the surprise." He held her gaze. There was something between them in that moment that had been building in the background of every conversation and every quiet evening, and every time one of them had reached toward the other without naming what they were reaching for. It was right there, close enough that he could feel the shape of it. "Clara," he said. "Yes?" she said. She knew what he was going to say. He could see it in her face, the knowledge and the waiting and the choosing to let it happen. "I think you know what I'm working toward," he said. "I think I do," she said. "I'm not going to rush it." "I know." "But I want you to know it's real," he said. "Whatever this is, it's real."
It was real a long time before I was going to say so. Clara looked at him with those direct, clear eyes that had seen him clearly from the first day. Not the mountain hermit, not the desperate stranger, not the man who'd walked into a saloon with a dying child and a single, impossible ask. Just him. What he was made of.
"I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a while."
He nodded. She nodded. And they stood there in the small side room with the sounds of Thomas and Lily at the breakfast table drifting through the wall. And it was enough, for now, to have said it. Some things didn't need to be hurried. Some things were better built slowly, the way good things were built, board by board, day by day, choice by choice. The afternoon that changed everything came without warning on the last Friday of September. Caleb was at the lumberyard when Cole came out of the back office with a different look on his face than usual. Not bad news, something else. He held a letter in his hand. "This came for you," Cole said. "Came through Patterson's office, forwarded here." Caleb took it. The letter was from the land office in Denver. It was 3 pages, dense with legal language, and it took him 2 reads to understand what it said. The Hargrove claim. The parcels James Hargrove had been riding to file when his wagon was hit. 30 acres in Summit County. Good land by the assessor's record, with water rights and timber access. The claim had been filed by James before he'd left Kansas. It was valid. The land office had been trying to locate surviving family for 2 months. As legal guardians of Thomas and Lily Hargrove, Caleb and Clara Hunter were the appropriate parties to receive and manage the claim on the children's behalf until they came of age. 30 acres of Colorado mountain land. James Hargrove's dream, riding west on the wagon that had burned. The dream hadn't died with him. It had just taken a different route to arrive. Caleb stood in the lumberyard with a letter in his hand and thought about James Hargrove. A man he'd never met. A man who'd taught his son to thank people and his daughter to make cornbread. And both of them to hold each other when everything else fell apart. A man who'd looked west and believed in something enough to stake his family's life on it. He folded the letter. He walked home faster than usual. He put the letter on the table in front of Clara that evening and watched her read it. She read it twice, the same as him. Then she set it down. Thomas was listening from the hallway. Caleb had heard him stop outside the door 30 seconds ago, but hadn't said anything. Lily was with him. He could hear them both, barely breathing. "Come in," Caleb said. They came in. They both looked at the letter. Thomas could read enough to understand it. Lily was watching Thomas's face to know what to feel. Thomas looked up. "That's Papa's land," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It belongs to you. Legally, to both of you." "What happens to it?" Thomas asked. "We manage it until you're grown," Caleb said. "Then it's yours to decide what to do with." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Can we go see it?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Is it near your cabin?" Thomas asked. Caleb thought about it. "Maybe 2 days' ride," he said. "Close enough." Thomas looked at the letter again, then at Caleb. "Papa wanted to build something," he said. "A real home, not a claim shack. A house. With a barn." His voice was careful, carrying the weight of a plan someone else had told him. He talked about it all the way from Kansas. He said Colorado was where things could be different. Lily said, "He said it every night when we made camp. He'd point at the stars and say, 'That one's ours when we get there.'" The room was completely silent. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. And something passed between them. Not words, not even a full thought. just a mutual arriving at the same place from two different directions. "Then that's what we'll do," Caleb said. Thomas looked up fast. "What?" "We'll build it," Caleb said. "What your father planned. The house. The barn." He held the boy's gaze. "Not this year. Maybe not next. But we'll build it. On his land. And you'll grow up in it." Thomas stared at him. Lily said, "All of us?" "All of us," Clara said. Her voice was steady and warm and absolutely certain. Lily looked at her, then at Caleb. Then she reached out and took one of each of their hands, Clara's on one side, Caleb's on the other, and she held them both, this 6-year-old girl who had survived more than children should survive, and come through it still believing that hands were worth reaching for. Thomas didn't reach for anything. He sat with the letter in front of him and looked at it, and his jaw worked, and he pressed his mouth together hard. And then he looked up at Caleb with eyes that were full and clear and absolutely unguarded. "I haven't said it back yet," Thomas said. His voice was quiet. Caleb looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," Thomas said, "but I want to." He took a breath. "Thank you. For finding us. For not leaving. For—" He stopped. He swallowed. "For being the kind of person who stays." The word "stays" hung in the room. Caleb held the boy's gaze and felt the full weight of the last 6 weeks. The riding and the fever and the saloon and the laughter and the silence and the papers and the chair and the nightmares and the dinner and the mornings. All of it pressing down and holding him in place the way good weight did. The weight of things that mattered. "That's all I know how to do," he said. That night, after the children slept, Caleb and Clara sat on the narrow landing outside their rooms, the closest thing these rooms above a general store had to a porch, and looked at the dark street below and the sky above Harlan's Creek, which was big and full and very quiet. The air had the particular clarity of a September night when summer has finally admitted it's done, and the stars were out in a way they rarely were in town, bright enough to cast faint shadows on the railing. Clara had a blanket around her shoulders. Caleb had his coat. They sat close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet. After a while, Clara said, "Are you happy?" He turned to look at her. The question surprised him, not because she'd asked it, but because of how simply she'd asked it. Not carefully, not with calculation, just, "Are you happy?" "I think so," he said. "I'm not sure I know what it's supposed to feel like, but if this is it," he looked out at the street, "then yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "All right." "That question I asked you in the saloon." She looked at him. "I've been asking it to myself every day since." He met her eyes. "And?" "Most days, yes," she said. "Some days I fall short. But most days—" She paused. "Are you?" He thought about it. Honestly, the way she deserved. "Today I was," he said. "When Thomas said—" He stopped. Started again. "When he called me that this morning, I stood at the counter and I thought, I don't deserve this yet. I haven't been at it long enough. I haven't earned it." He looked at his hands. "And then I thought, maybe that's not how it works. Maybe you don't earn it first and receive it after. Maybe you receive it and spend the rest of your life making sure you were worth it." Clara was very still beside him. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing I've heard anyone say." He looked at her. "You asked me to be kind," he said. "I think that's what kindness is. Not the easy moments.
the deciding, every day, to try. She held his gaze in the dark, and in her eyes he saw the same thing he'd seen that first morning in the saloon, when she'd stood up and walked toward him, across a room full of people who were waiting for her to sit back down. That steady, clear, undeflectable quality, that absolute willingness to meet the real thing and not flinch. "Yes," she said, soft and certain. "Yes, what?" he said. "Yes," she said again. And she didn't explain it, because it didn't need explaining. It was the answer to everything they hadn't said yet, and everything they would say in time. It was the word that closed the space between practical and real, between necessary and chosen, between two people who had walked into something they didn't understand and come out the other side knowing exactly what they'd found. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that in the September dark, with James Hargrove's 30 acres waiting in a valley 2 days north, with 2 children sleeping inside who had started to believe again in solid ground, with a town that was slowly, reluctantly, deciding they belonged in it, and the whole long future of it stretched out ahead of them, imperfect and real, and entirely theirs. Caleb Hunter had walked into a saloon 6 weeks ago with nothing but a dying child and an impossible ask. He walked out of that summer with a family, a purpose, a piece of land, and a woman beside him who had asked him one question and trusted him enough to believe the answer. He spent the rest of his life making sure she was right too.